to each other, the UN has called the US out for harassing and abusing people, particularly racial minorities. And the US has said, you're right, we're working on it, here's all the great progress that we've made. So there's this history of this being understood as a problem in the United States. And what we've done is with our report, we started with youth testimonies to distill these themes, and then we were able to find data, right? We started looking, what's the data say? And it absolutely, of course, supported what young people have been saying for a really long time in this city. And so we see that there's this really, that not only is harassment and abuse taking place, but that it's happening the invasive and degrading harassment is happening at really alarming rates. We're seeing intimidation, we're seeing invasive and abusive searches, we're seeing theft of property, we're seeing verbal abuse. I have another testimony I want to bring up now from a young person that was shared at our hearing that we held in August. So this person said, we're sitting in a house playing video games and we hear a banging on the door. Before we know it, the door is kicked down and there's 5 special ops officers with their huge M16s drawn, pointed at us. 3 15-year-olds playing video games. And they tell us, get on the ground. They say, if we move, they are gonna kill us. Don't look at me, we'll fucking kill you in a second. Pointing their guns at us, then they don't find anything. They let us all go, they laugh, try to joke with us, apologize, then leave out. And we're sitting there like, what just happened? They tear up the house, they stole money. So the thing about Chicago is that it's really hard for us to document sort of the daily grind of harassment that young people of color are experiencing in this city. I think a really common thing that people think of when they think of harassment is stop and frisk, right? And we know that that happens in Chicago, right? You can walk through some neighborhoods and you're guaranteed to see several people, right, getting stopped and patted down. And I think New York offers a really exciting example of some of the ways that activists have worked to resist stop and frisk. But here in Chicago, the way that we document encounters between police and civilians doesn't allow us to actually figure out how much stop and frisk is happening. And this is for really complicated reasons of both being like over-inclusive of information and under-inclusive. Like they collect too much data and not enough. And it makes it really hard for us to show that harassment is a problem and stop and frisk is a problem, and particularly for people of color. So what I mean is that when the police have any encounter with just a regular person, right, and it doesn't lead to an arrest, they have to fill out something called a contact card. Now, an example of this is when you involuntarily stop someone and search them. That is just one of many different kinds of encounters that would be recorded on this piece of paper. However, the way that it works is you fill out, here's what happened, here's their name, and there's a description box. It doesn't explicitly ask you to indicate, was this person involuntarily stopped and frisked? So there's no way to figure out if it was a stop and frisk or some other kind of encounter. So we have this huge database of encounters, but we don't know how many of them are involuntary. And then if it leads to an arrest, we don't have a documentation system that determines whether or not they were arrested as a result of an involuntary stop and frisk. So it makes it really hard for us to show this. However, the ACLU of Illinois actually went through the CPD's database and used keyword searches. So they went through and they were able to be like, okay, so we can, if we look through all of the documents that have these keywords, we can tell these ones definitely someone was involuntarily stopped and searched. And looking at that, they can see, okay, absolutely within this, we're seeing a ton of really unlawful stop and searches, right? There were no grounds for this person to be stopped and searched. Now, another thing that we can look at is we can look at complaint records. So if you look at between 2002 and 2004, we know most people when something bad happens to them with the cops, like I can speak to this. I never am like, I'm gonna go report this. Like I don't think anything's gonna happen. A lot of people are afraid to make a complaint, right? They're afraid of some kind of retaliation, or they don't know the process, right? I don't even know how to exactly go about making a complaint. So we know that it's a very small percentage of folks that actually do complain when something happens. And we see, between 2002 and 2004, we had 3,837 people say that they felt they were illegally searched by the CPD. Of all of those complaints, only 0.03% are sustained, meaning they have some kind of penalty given out. Only one out of those 3,837 complaints had any kind of meaningful penalty. And a meaningful penalty means that they get suspended for a week or more. Most penalties are just violation noted or reprimand, like slaps on the wrist. And I'll talk more about this impunity that we're seeing, it comes up a lot, right? So this is something that, there's a lot of different violations taking place, but I really want to point out Article 11, which says there needs to be a systemic federal level database, right, and standards for what kind of information is being collected, right? Like all police departments need to be able to show how many involuntary stops and searches are taking place. The U.S. has been called out on this repeatedly, and they just are refusing to do it, and we are going to make sure that they get called out again when we're there. And we want to change those contact card systems. Now, another thing is excessive force. So the use of excessive force is really endemic to the Chicago Police Department. We have a really big problem here in Chicago of use of excessive force, right? And that, I understand, is like being a euphemism. This is the language that the UN use. It's police violence, right? It's police crimes. And it's really terrible here in Chicago. And it's not just a few bad apples. It's something that it's implicating thousands of officers, and the impunity with which it's occurring implicates the entire department. So I have another story. This was shared by someone named Christopher at our public hearing. So Christopher said, and so last year I flame up the blunt. They hit the sirens. I come out, put my hands behind my head, and get on the ground, get on the ground. Cool, I get on the ground. Next thing I know, I wake up in the back of a police station, and I don't even know what happened to me, to be honest with you. That's how bad they beat me. I guarantee you, I'm sitting in the Cook County Jail with 22 stitches in my tongue, 2 facial fractures, bruised ribs, scrapes all over my body. I still can't talk right to this day. I can't eat certain things. I had an orbital fracture, a nasal fracture, like, say, that had to stitch my tongue back together. I almost didn't have no tongue. Like, it was literally hanging on by a thread. I could feel it, like I could feel my tongue at my chin. Yeah, it's stuff that I shouldn't have done, but at the same time, I came out willingly. I came out with my hands up, giving myself in. There's no reason to use force like that. Now, I can't even go back and file reports or sue the police officer, get the badge numbers or nothing. Like, they scarred me out of my whole life. So all of these testimonies that I'm reading through, none of them have, like, had a sustained penalty where the person involved has gotten, like, compensation, right? So again, multiple article violations taking place here. Okay, so this is where things get a little bit complicated. So I'm going to talk through sort of 2 stories of data, pre-IPRA and post-IPRA. So before 2007, the Chicago Police Department was taking care of all complaints, right? So any complaint that was made was handled by the Internal Affairs Division of the CPD. And so what we found then is that Chicago had a lot of brutality complaints being made against it, and they had a shockingly low amount of those complaints leading to any kind of penalty. So we had only 0.48% of CPD brutality complaints were being sustained, and that this was actually 94% below the national average, right? So we know that we have a problem in the United States of police brutality and people getting away with it, and Chicago was like horrifically terrible and exceptional in that. So what ended up happening, actually, and this is something that I learned after the report. The report, we had a very narrow amount of time to research and write that whole thing. And since then, I've learned that IPRA was actually set up sort of as a response to people pushing back against this. Now, what has happened so IPRA is the Independent Police Review Authority, and they are tasked with handling all investigations of any shooting that happens. They also keep track of uses of tasers. And then they also deal with any complaints that have to do with excessive force, domestic violence, and verbal abuse. So any of those kinds of complaints are handled by IPRA. The rest, including things like sexual assault charges, are handled still by the CPD. What IPRA has done is it's magically moved that 0.48 up to a measly 1%. That's all, right? So still, we're not making anywhere near sufficient progress. And we can see also, right, if you look at IPRA between 2011 and 2012, you have over 8,452 complaints being made, and only 105 are sustained. If you look at the most recent report that IPRA puts out of all of the sustained investigations, which is the only thing that they release, is the ones that are sustained, the first case is from, I think, 2005. That's not prompt, right? This is a complaint made in 2005 that just now was finally given a penalty. So we have this problem of excessive force taking place and with impunity. As I said, these numbers implicate the entire department, but I do want to highlight one really bad apple. I want to highlight Glenn Evans, who is featured here. So Glenn Evans, between 1988 and 2008, had over 45 excessive force complaints made against him, more than any other officer in that time period. Since then, he's had many dozens more complaints made against him. IPRA said that he should be fired. They recommended for his dismissal. That was ignored. He gets promoted. He's actually the commander of District 11. He's only recently been indicted for, I believe, 1 or 2 specific complaints But folks in the room know many young people have been terrorized by this person for a really long time. Really awful person, commander of District 11. And the march that we have this evening, I really invite as many of you as possible to come out. It's at 6 p.m. in front of the District 11 Police Headquarters, and we're going to be calling him out, and also another data set that I'll be explaining in just a few minutes, the 662 worst officers as well, sort of protesting this violence and the impunity with which it's occurring. All right, so now I'm going to talk through deadly force. So there were a lot of numbers, especially because of ICRA, that help us understand the ways that deadly force is being used, specifically against people of color. And this is where you start to see especially black people, right? So black people are 10 times more likely to be shot by the police in Chicago than white people. If you look at between 2009 and 2013, over 75% of police shooting victims were black. Just this year alone, in the first 6 months of this year, 27 people were shot, 23 of them were black. Again, we have a problem of police shooting people throughout the country and in Chicago for sure, especially. And so in response to this, what people have done is they're like, well, why don't we give the cops tasers? That way, when they have to use force, it's not as deadly. So back in, and this is something even the UN suggested, the Committee Against Torture specifically suggested, and we're going to be saying, hey, that's not working, because what we're seeing here in Chicago is that the number of shootings hasn't gone down, right? There's been no decrease in the number of shootings. Instead, we now have the added and disproportionate application of tasers against people of color. And so we have 92% of taser uses that have occurred between 2009 and 2011 are being used against black and Latino people. 49 of those are young people ages 8 to 16. We're using tasers on 8-year-olds. Like, that's absurd, right? Another thing, so by the way, in 2010, the CPD actually purchased 600 tasers and distributed them. The other thing, so here in 2014, if we look at just the first 6 months, there have been 186 uses of tasers by the Chicago police, and 146 of them were against black people. So 146 out of 186 times against black people. One of them was Damo. So another issue of deadly force, right? I started earlier by talking specifically about police shootings, and this ties back to the issue of impunity. Folks hopefully know about the case of Rashad McIntosh, right, or Rashad McIntosh, who was shot and killed by the CPD about a month ago. And there have been a lot of protests taking place. Community witnesses all say that he had his hands up, was saying, my hands are up, don't shoot me, please don't kill me, right, were his last words. I have another testimony I'm going to share now. So it says, due to the killing of Rashad McIntosh, the police is harassing the citizens in this community. On the side of the building where he was murdered, there were citizens playing cards who saw the entire encounter. When one of them spoke out, the police beat him. The residents in this community are scared and fear that it could be them. The way they intimidated the crowd that night of the murder was a sign of the police being a gang, taking up for their own, and trying to cover up what really happened. This community is outraged that they shot him down in broad daylight and are intimidating citizens because they want to tell what happened. The detective leading this case has yet to speak with any of the citizens that were present at the time of this homicide. They haven't released any information to our family or even a phone call about something so simple as a police report, nor autopsy. We need answers, and we're going to all costs to get them. I hope you can help us in any way, because we need all the help we can get. We're not even allowed to go to the police station and talk to anyone. Every time we go, they tell us they would give us a call, but it never happened. They still haven't released the name of the officer who shot Rashad, and his mother wants to know. So actually this isn't the last one, I have one more. So next is sexual assault. And this is something that we really leaned heavily on the work that the Young Women's Empowerment Project had done, because they had this incredible report that has a ton of testimonies that speak to the sexual violence that the Chicago police are inflicting on young people. And so I have another story here that says, I was walking to the bus when a police officer called out and said, hey you, come here girl with all of that ass. I ignored the comment, unaware of where it was coming from, until he pulled up on the curb to block my path in his undercover cop car. He jumps out and yells, didn't you hear me calling you girl? I replied simply by saying, no, my name isn't girl with all that ass. He got very mad and slapped me, saying I was disrespectful and saying, don't you know who I am? I began to fear him, so I slowly backed away, and he ran up and choke slammed me, saying I insulted an officer and was under arrest. When people started to come And look, he handcuffed me, placed me in the back seat and drove away. When we stopped at an alley, I realized he wasn't taking me in. He got out of the car, came to where I was, and tried to rape me. The CPD still handles all complaints around sexual assault. Only 20% of those complaints lead to any kind of penalty. And so we know that young people, through strip searches, but also just through just general encounters that start on the sidewalk, are being sexually assaulted by the police, right? It's sexual harassment, it's sexual violence, it's rape. And this is absolutely torture. This is the UN has said, if a law enforcement does any kind of sexual violence against a person in the country, that's torture. That's not cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, it's torture. And we know this is happening, right? And it's happening with impunity. Another thing is that because of the ways that young people of color are being targeted by the police, we know that we live in an era of mass incarceration, right? And so young people of color are being sent into detention centers, right? Juvenile detention centers. And the ones that we have in Illinois, again, are quite exceptional in how awful they are. And 15% of the young people in juvenile detention centers are sexually victimized by adult staff, by guards, right? 15%, that's 50% greater than the national average. Now, the other thing is that even the United States, the UN condemns solitary confinement and isolation of prisoners, right? Even the US is oh, we still think it's kind of okay, but not young people. We don't do that to our young people, unless it's to protect them. So young people that are sexually victimized while incarcerated are then put into solitary confinement in the name of protecting them, which is the US and the UN acknowledges that's also torture. We're torturing our young people through sexual violence, absolutely. So then this connects to this issue of mass arrest and detention. We live in the era of mass incarceration. When we look at young people, we see overwhelmingly that black folks, especially young black people, are the bulk of who is being incarcerated and targeted of our young people. So even though black people only account for 33% of the Chicago population, in 2011 we see that 77% of youth arrests were of black people. And in 2012 we see that 79% of youth arrests were of black people. And if you look at, there are 25 police districts. Doesn't matter what district, doesn't matter what the demographics are of that district. Every single one, the percentage of black people who are arrested is significantly greater than the percentage of black people who live in that neighborhood. And it's at its worst in a majority white neighborhood, majority white districts. Let me make sure. So this is something that I really want to point out. So the Black Youth Project, or BYP 100, has been doing a campaign around trying to address the criminalization of blackness. And we know that police on a daily basis, the most common thing they're doing is they're going out and they're arresting black people for weed when they're supposed to be giving tickets. So that's at a campaign that's happening right now that folks can support. They have a petition, they need support, right? That helps to address some of these issues. Because the bulk of these are folks that are getting caught up because of they're being arrested for marijuana when they should just be ticketed. Another thing that we have, though, is this threat of mass arrest. So I have a story here. The police rounded up everyone on a block corner because of an incident that happened down the block. Whoever fit the description was liable to be arrested and detained. My sister's boyfriend was arrested for unruly behavior for expressing grief over his nephew being shot. I was threatened to be arrested for the same offense if I didn't leave the scene, although I live across the street. I believe the police in my neighborhood are only interested in filling their quotas. So I want to highlight again another local issue that's taking place, which is over the murder of Deshaun Pittman, a young Chicagoan who was recently killed by the Chicago police. And after his death, there were some protests, and his mother was arrested as well as several of his friends. The mother was able to be bailed out so that she could make it to her son's funeral, but there are still, I believe, 3 people from that, 3 young people who are still in jail and need to be bailed out. They have really absurdly high bails set. One has a lower bail of about, I think it was $1,900. They need $1,900 more to get this one person out of jail. So folks can make a donation. If you look up Bond, Devontae, and LaKendra out of jail, they need money to get those young people out. So then this big issue of inaction and impunity that has sort of been already called in several times now. So here, we were really lucky when we started working on this report. There was this huge data set that had just been made public to us through the Invisible Institute. And this data set showed sort of like the worst of the worst. So the first thing is that it showed us between, I have to look up the years, hold on one second. What we saw was that between 2002 and 2008, there were 195 CPD officers who had at least 5 or more excessive force complaints made against them. All right. Now, if we look at those 195 police officers, only 28 of them got any penalty at all. So only 2%. So if you look at all the complaints made against them, there were 1,509. Only 2% of them had some kind of penalty. So it's 32 complaints actually led to something. And we see most of them, 41% are just reprimands, a violation noted. 31% are suspensions of less than a week, so 1 to 5 days. If we look at more generally, just general misconduct complaints, we see that between 2001 and 2006, there were 662 police officers who had at least 10 or more misconduct complaints made against them. Out of the combined 10,735 complaints, only 219 were given any kind of penalty. So 508 of these 662 officers have never gotten a penalty for any of those things. So some of the issues of the ways that complaints are handled, right? If the CPD handles it, in 85% of the complaints, the officer that's named in the complaint isn't even interviewed, right? They're not even interviewed to be like, hey, someone complained that this happened. What can you tell me your side of the story? They don't even bother in 85% of the cases. The other issue is that these are just sort of like the initial, yeah, this penalty is what we recommend. But then there's many other layers of folks above that have an opportunity to appeal or dismiss that complaint. So we think that about half of them don't even end up making it all the way up to the top. The other issue is that we have, we know that if we look at officers who in the span of 5 years receive 50 or more complaints in that 5 years, that only 13% of them are getting flagged for early intervention or monitoring programs. So we know that like the education and training is not sufficient, right? Only 13% of officers with 50 or more complaints in just 5 years are being flagged for like, hey, you need some extra training here. And we also know, right, that we're not seeing prompt and impartial investigations because not even the cops are being interviewed, right? Absolutely absurd. I think that was everything. Yes. Okay. So all of this is to say, right, that at base, the CPD's conduct constitutes as torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and it's occurring at extraordinary rates, disproportionately against minorities, against young people of color specifically, and with impunity. And I want to add that this violence is being used as a way to really silence, isolate, control, and repress people of color, particularly young people. Right? And I have one last testimony I want to share, which is, I'm affected greatly by police brutality, directly and indirectly. Even seeing other human beings being harassed by police, I still feel violated because it's violent. It's not acceptable at all. It's a total disregard for people's value. The way police carry themselves and the way they talk to people is disgusting. It's horrible. It's violent. It's a flexing of authority. They like oppressing people, and it seems like that's the whole intention, to like take people's power away from them. A lot of times I feel like my power is being taken away. So that was by a young person named Marlon, by the way. So that's what we shared in this report. That's sort of a rough overview.